This year's M1 Pro and M1 Max made everyone rethink on the basis of last year's crazy accumulation. All the masters expressed a very strong recognition of its productivity in video creation. Many filmmakers and television hurricane even sold all of their PCs and replaced them with M1 Max MacBook Pros. But at the same time, also many people who have doubts. Is this laptop dedicated for video creation? But actually, I'm a gamer. Is this computer okay for me? Well, its actual performance in other areas than the video creation, is it as powerful as Apple said in the actual press conference? Well, does that mean that Mac has finally hope to play games? The top-notch MacBook Pro 16 selected for the top-notch configuration more than $4,700, but it can't even play Genshin Impact unless you are willing to use a magical method. In order to play the mobile version of Genshin Impact, by the way, the mobile version does not support the versatility of keyboard and mouse. Now, if you look at all the way, there are really not many games that can be played directly on the Mac. Even for the game that can be played, the game experience is not so good. For example, the average frame rate of CSGO is just around 100 frames per second, and I don't think this is a great gaming experience at all. But I don't blame the M1 Max for all these problems. After all, Rosetta is now very mature. When the Mac was still using Intel processor, if you are insisted on playing games, at least you could use Bootcamp to install Windows. But since the day the Mac was replaced with the M1, the word Bootcamp has completely become a history. Mac and Windows have truly become incompatible. If you want to play Windows games on a new Mac, now either you have a Windows on an ARM virtual machine, and in all fairness, you can actually play a lot of games like Battlefield 3, GTA 5. Now some people will say that you can run Rosetta 2 directly under the macOS, and through that can you able to run Windows games? Well, it's really complicated, and although games can be played, but it's still very limited. So if you are a serious gamer, seeing the M1 Max performance won't cover your wallet. I still advise you think twice before doing it. After all, there are more than 30,000 notebooks available for you that can play Genshin Impact, and I don't think everyone can accept it. Professional softwares on the Mac are still in the process of being updated. Most of the software for daily use already have versions that run natively on ARM, but there are currently only a few relatively large games onto the game sites. If you talk about the games, you can see that the makers of the game truly see that Mac is not the platform to build games for. After all, Mac is not very good in the game field. At least this is the impression. The impression has already been deployed and rooted in the hearts of the people. But if you want to still know how the game performance of M1 Pro and M1 Max is, but because there are not good cross-platform testing tools and nothing suitable for testing native games, so we finally decided to make a benchmark for ourselves to test their GPU gaming performance. In a true excitement, we made a demo, then we packaged it and ran it, and all the excitement was gone. Whoa, is it running smoothly? I mean, the frame rate, the visuals are really good. And then I opened up the activity monitor and saw that I clearly typed the Apple Silicon package, but still it's running under the Rosetta. So truly, like, what can game manufacturers do? So we had to go back to the starting point again, and then we decided to try the Unity engine for the first time. And sure enough, the compatibility of Unity engine is definitely well deserved, and well, here we use official test scene of Unity as the basis to make it natively running on an Apple Silicon environment. This benchmark forces a 2560 by 1440 run through a specific camera path and then records the average frame of the run through the scene to reduce the CPU load as much as possible. From the test results of the Unity, the GPU of the M1 Max seems to be better than Razer Blade 5 Plus. The 140-watt Notebook 3080 is a lot weaker, and the 3060 and 6600 XT, they are much stronger than the 3050. But this test result always feels weird. Is the presentation at Apple's conference a lie? I ran 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme Unlimited test, and the M1 Mac can run natively, and the results at Unity's test results are quite different. In the 3D Mark, the performance of M1 Max is much less than that of the 140-watt 3080. Youth versions of M1 Pro are closer to the performance of 3050 according to the test result. Although the Unreal 5 demo we did, it can only run in a Rosetta environment, but the test results are closer to the 3D Mark results than the native Unity. From the results of Unreal 5, the results of 3D Mark test are basically in line with the M1. The actual performance of M1 Max is close because the CPU load of our demo is relatively low in order to reduce the impact of the CPU on the performance. So although the translation will bring a relatively large loss of the CPU performance, it seems that the loss of GPU performance is not very large, and the Unreal 5 performance on the Mac M1 series is indeed significantly better than that of Unity. It looks like that Unity has a lot of room for optimization on the Mac. If the Mac can continue to work on the GPU, it may not be completely impossible for game manufacturers to follow up on the Mac. While running 3D Mark, the maximum power consumption of M1 Max is about 40 watt and the M1 Pro is about 20 watt. This is lower than the 140 watt 3080 and 55 watt 3050. Actually, those are too much from the energy consumption ratio standpoint, or 6600 XT. With minimum configuration, the castrated version of M1 Pro is only equipped with a 3050 wrench. So the M1 Max can only say that in terms of games, it has muscle and everything else is not yet ready. But the excellent energy consumption ratio allows us to see the strength of Apple. Ignoring that the GPU is only the A14 M1 generation architecture, the better new architecture GPU on the A15 has not been installed on the Mac. After testing the GPU, let's take a look at the CPU performance of the M1 Pro and M1 Max. M1 Pro is the minimum configuration version, which has 6 plus 2 CPU cores plus 16 gigs of memory. My M1 Max is at top version having 8 plus 2 CPU cores and 64 gigabytes of memory. Now let's take a look at the most familiar Cinebench R23 test. The M1 Pro ran a multi-core of 9500 and the single core performance is 1500. This score is slightly stronger than that of i5 11260H, which is slightly lower than the 11900H onto the Razer Blade 5 Plus. In terms of frequency strategy, M1 single turbo core is 3.2 GHz and all core turbo is 3.0 GHz. It is the calibration that prioritizes the energy consumption over the extreme power consumption. But today, 12th gen notebook product is already on the line. I thought that Apple would increase the CPU frequency a little on such heavyweight product. So even though the architecture of M1 Max is still the IPC champion, the 12th generation with more aggressive frequency will be a single core king for the next year. I don't know if Apple will improve the single core performance of the M2 series next year due to the process improvements, but the CPU performance is too one-sided if you just run Cinebench. Blender now supports Apple Silicon natively, so we made a simple scene to compare the performance of the CPUs, and well, the peak performance of the CPU part under the native software is roughly the level of the 11th generation i9 H45 or Ryzen 5000 series notebook standard processors. Considering the 12th generation of the notebook is not far away, I think the peak performance of the CPU can be only regarded as a good thing. Especially compared with the GPU performance, it can be only said that Apple is still a little conservative in terms of CPU performance. But you know, Apple is still Apple. In contrast, the power consumption of 5800H with similar performance is 59 watt and power consumption of 11900H is nearly 100 watt. It is foreseeable that 12th generation mobile terminals cannot achieve energy consumption of the M1 Max. And well, the direct result of this comparison is that 16-inch version of the M1 Max, after 30 minutes of Cinebench test, the CPU will not be underclocked with or without external power supply. And if you are not familiar with the Mac, you may think that it is a new incredible feature. 16-inch MacBook Pro of M1X, whether it's a GPU or CPU, M1 Max, when using the battery or plugging it in, the same performance is always maintained. But the the performance of the GPU under the battery is really bad. So I have to complain about the old yellow and the most advanced GPU. The GPU architecture uses Samsung's 8nm process, RTX 30 series graphics card, and 14-inch M1 Pro are fully loaded, and the typical power consumption of both of those has to be said that their energy consumption is higher than the current one, and I can't really find an opponent. But in addition to the power consumption, in the peak power state, for daily use it is equally important. Let's compare the power consumption of 13-inch M1 and 14-inch M1 Pro and 16-inch M1 Max in daily scenarios. We have opened two 4K videos at 200 nits of brightness and the volume is half turned on, and here you can see M1 Max needs to run at about 7 watts of SoC power consumption, while M1 Pro is only consuming about 3 watts and M1 is only surprisingly consuming just 1 watt. Not to mention, because of the larger, brighter mini LED screen, the extra power consumption of the whole machine is brought about by the exaggerated external display. After all, M1 Max is equipped with the 64GB 512-bit memory, and the energy consumption ratio is not as abnormal as the M1. From the actual use situation, even though the battery is much larger than the battery of the M1 Max, the MacBook Pro 16 is indeed not as good as the M1's MacBook Pro 13. So if you buy a Mac for the purpose of daily office use, you can't use the M1 Pro. Compared with the performance of the M1 Max, M1 is a still good choice. In general, if you look at the new MacBook Pro from the perspective of a traditional PC without calling any special units, it seems that the power consumption ratio and battery life is very good, along with good workmanship and peripheral configuration. But the absolute performance is roughly equivalent to 11800H plus 3070 mobile laptop. And it seems that after next year's 12th gen processor, its current performance advantage may also be gone. But is it really just that? Well, certainly not. M1 Pro has 200 Gbps memory bandwidth, while M1 Max has a 400 GB per second memory bandwidth. As a comparison to Intel's 12th generation desktop, Core i9-12900K with dual channel DDR4 4000, you can get about 60 Gbps of memory bandwidth. With quad DDR4 3200 can get you about 100 Gbps of memory bandwidth. Put it bluntly, I have never seen that kind of a memory bandwidth on a processor. Because to achieve such a high memory bandwidth, it's not just about putting more memory into it, but also a larger scale memory controller is required. The 512-bit memory controller only appeared on processors like 3995WX, but before that, 3995WX still has a DDR4 memory because of the memory bandwidth is not enough. It is only the half of the M1 Max. So why does Apple provided such a high memory bandwidth? Is it just for the sake of picture? Well, of course not. In fact, this design idea is not Apple's family. This is the PS5's motherboard, which has a 256-bit GDDR6 video memory on board, as the same memory is shared by CPU and GPU, having theoretical bandwidth of 448 Gbps, even slightly higher than the M1 Max, although it looks different from the design of M1 Max, which is directly placed near the die. They are really a distant relatives. Apple began to use UMA memory architecture on M1, where the memory modules are placed directly next to the CPU. So all the components in the SoC such as CPU and GPU can use unified large memory. And the memory ideas of PS5 and Xbox are actually similar, but implementation is slightly different. For the detailed process of scheduling strategy, you can watch the video given in the description below. The memory bandwidth that can be scheduled by the CPU of M1 Pro and M1 Max is 200 Gbps, which is roughly equivalent to the threading tiering on a PC. The bandwidth of the powerful 3995WX with 8-channel DDR4 3200 memory has the huge memory belt of M1 Max. The width is actually for the GPU. So the CPU part of the two is indeed exactly the same. Apple's craftsmanship is very superb. You can see the GPU part is the real difference between the two dies. M1 Pro can schedule 200 Gbps bandwidth while M1 Max can schedule 400 Gbps. In fact, the biggest advantage brought by this unified memory architecture, which has 2 points. One, that for CPU, when encountering a computational task that requires extremely high bandwidth, it can obtain bandwidth as high as video memory. In fact, the most typical scenario in this is that video editing under extremely high resolution footage, such a real-time task require huge data exchange, which requires very high memory bandwidth. Well, another advantage of that is unified memory architecture for GPU allows it to obtain huge amount of data when it needed. You should know that video memory capacity for the desktop 3090 has only 24 gigabytes of video memory, but the M1 Max can choose up to 64 gigabytes of memory, and it becomes even more impossible for the GPU to burst the video memory. And this is very important for 3D projects with huge textures, large projects like C4D and etc. Apple's recent addition to the Blender Foundation makes me believe that soon we will see how this capacity of the video memory can be used. The M1 series makes everyone realize how important the various acceleration units are integrated into the SoC. On last year's M1, H.264 and H.265 acceleration units have already made a video creators exclaim, FCPX export performance is so much powerful. However, Intel's counterpart has also the similar acceleration units, but this time M1 Pro and M1 Max not only have H.264 and H.265, they also integrate an additional acceleration unit that is very helpful for professional consumers. It is the ProRes acceleration unit. And remember that there is an optional afterburner accelerator card on the Mac Pro. But because Apple didn't have a powerful enough processor at that time, this only could be used in an expansion card which can be inserted on a PCIe. The optional price of the accelerator card is also very touching. You can get a ProRes, the hardware decoding ability of the material, but right now with same price you can directly buy M1 Pro notebook that comes with all this stuff. After doing the math, you can understand why Tim from the Next Door Video Hurricane sells all the PC he has. Some people on the internet say that the Mac of M1 Pro and M1 Max is a computer optimized for video creators. To be honest, there are many masters who have tested the performance of the new MacBook Pro. And while editing, it is said that higher the specification of your PC is, better the performance of your computer. And the performance of FCPX and DaVinci Resolve are very stronger than PR. As for the most outrageous situation, you can go to the evaluation of the first release of the film and television Hurricane. But the premise is that your video does not use AE in addition to the advantage of hardware itself. Besides this, the generation of MacBook Pro is a notebook computer also has an excellent overall quality among its peers. First of all, the design is very controversial this time. I have to say this, I hate this empty notches. It bugs me all the time. I can't accept that empty bangs. If it's like an iPhone notch is stuffed up with lot of sensors to bring Face ID structure and light to the notebook, but it is totally unacceptable that it only has a 1080p camera on it. With a wide angle 12MP camera, can such a small camera cover up lot like that bigger notch? I don't really understand what Apple means by such a design change. But apart from the bangs, overall design of this new structure, it looks bulky, heavy, and looks like a MacBook Pro from a decade ago. But what a Pro laptop should be like. I'm a victim of a 16-inch MacBook Pro. At that time, in order to make machine thin and light, Apple used butterfly keyboard that made people throb the brain, cut off various interfaces, and cut off easy to use MagSafe charging port. 3 of the Thunderbolt 4 ports can be also quite sufficient for most of the tasks. Also note that these are independent Thunderbolt buses. Now there should not be other notebooks with such a similar design. There is also a headphone jack that I have never seen on a laptop, and to operate its headphone jack, there is a built-in amplifier that can be really handy to push those large impedance monitoring headphones like this AKG K702. This is definitely a good news for many musicians who use Macs as their audio workstations. And this MacBook Pro, its screen quality can be said well deserved. Mini LED in the current notebook, which brings the amazing display, contrast, and under the HDR, peak brightness is very amazing. The color gamut and color accuracy performance are also hard to pick out. By the way, 120Hz high refresh rate is also added in addition to the screen. The external display of this generation of MacBook Pro is also surprised me. I have never thought that laptop could make such a nice sounds. I suggest you to go to the store and try it for yourself. And another thing that is worth mentioning is cooling. This generation Mac has air inlets onto the left and right sides, but reason for the hand cutting is that it has lot bigger opening, which brings a considerable amount of airflow. We use TG Pro to manually pull the fan to the highest air intake. If you open up the back cover, you will see a single heat pipe design. But what no one tells you is the thickness of the heat pipe. And Apple's fan strategy is very conservative. It tends to make the computer work silently as possible. So if you have a monitoring software, you'll find that even if the GPU and CPU are both fully loaded up, its fans are not working up to the full speeds. So that's the reason it feels very hot. And if you control the fans manually for 10 minutes on Cinebench, you'll find that the maximum core temperature of the CPU is very less. It's just 70 degrees. And I forgot to say that this sensor measures the hotspot temperature inside the CPU, which is higher than the actual CPU core temperature that we usually read. In other words, this is the first time that the cooling design of the MacBook Pro has made me feel good. So aside from the two processors, M1 Pro and M1 Max, the quality of the MacBook Pro is really something, and for professional users with these features, it's almost invincible. But considering it can't even play Genshin Impact, it may not be suitable for you. And if you wanted to use it for just the text editing and work, I think last year M1 MacBook Pro or even M1 MacBook Air is a better choice. Because this computer is so heavy, this time the new MacBook Pro is good, but not necessarily for you. You may say that I don't play games anyway and it doesn't matter, I have decided. So here are the things you may need to know. Even small 14-inch version has a weight of 1.6 kg. For 14-inch notebook, it is definitely not light. In other words, this machine is already half pound heavier than M1 MacBook Pro 13. If it's a really lighter notebook, for example, if you compare it with a ThinkPad X1 Nano, it is only 0.9 kg heavier. This computer is faster than two X1 Nanos, and top version of the 16-inch M1 Max has a weight of 2.2 kgs, which has caught up with some gaming laptops. So if you often travel on business and things like that, but your work is not very performance hungry, then I think you need to consider the weight of this computer. In fact, the compatibility of Rosetta is very good. Basically, the software that old Macs can run, the M1 series Macs can run too. The performance of these two new processors is not necessarily better than the performance compared with the M1. The single core performance of these two new processors has not improved, and after the translation, they do not support the AVIX instruction set, which makes the performance of some software that has been not adapted to the original version not ideal to use. For example, After Effects has not updated the native M1 version. Using Puget Systems test, it can be clearly seen that its performance is far worse than native PR. So if there is no native software comparisons like AE in your workflow, I suggest you wait and see. On other hand, some software itself does not have a Mac version. Moreover, domestic software environment, even if it is a Mac version of many software, you may not be able to learn. If you are a college student and teacher asks you to go home and use this XX software and to do your homework, then send a software in the group. Your friends have finished homework and you are still looking for the download address, software and things like that. Considering that M1 series of the Mac have basically said goodbye to the Windows, if you strongly depend on to the software ecosystem of the Windows, it's best to think twice about it. So basically, screen is really good, but if you don't usually watch HDR content, it is better for the future. So you need to accurately estimate what your needs before you deep dive into it. This year's MacBook Pro is equipped with M1 Pro, and M1 Max. This shows us how Apple's styles of stacking up make quantitative changes has become a qualitative change. The new processors at chip level have enough powerful performance and have unmatched energy consumption. The new Pro model, the new Pro level body structure, new thermal design, and the return of large battery, and possibly with the notebook that can produce HDR video in the whole process. All these things show why MacBook Pro carries Pro in its naming title. So the new MacBook Pro is indeed a better one. Your Mac is amazing, but it might not be your next computer. If you found this video helpful, make sure to hit that like, share this video, subscribe to our channel, and this is Kedar from How To Guys signing out.